In this video, I want to give you an overview of the Old Testament, so let's begin with the name. The word testament means covenant. It's called the Old Testament because it came first before the New. We could also refer to the Old Testament as the Hebrew Bible. Now, the Old Testament was written from about 1440 BC to 430 BC. Although we don't have exact dates, this is a pretty good estimate based on what we find in the books of the Bible. The Old Testament was primarily written in Hebrew, but a few portions were written in Aramaic. And the Old Testament is not one book, it's actually a collection of 39 books that are ordered in our English Bibles by genre. Most people divide up the Old Testament into 5 sections, and I want to introduce you to each section so you can better understand and comprehend the structure of the Old Testament. The first section is called the Law. It includes the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy. Another name for this section is the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books. While this section is called the Law, these books certainly aren't just a collection of laws. They tell the history of God's people from the very beginning, starting in Genesis 1:1, and goes all the way up to the people's entrance into the Promised Land. The second section is called History. These history books include the books of Joshua through Esther. These books record Israel's history from their entrance into the Promised Land until the end of the exile. These books talk about the reign of the kings in Israel, the division of the people of Israel into 2 nations, their exile, and their eventual return from exile to the Promised Land. Now, these books aren't pure history. They don't read like history books. Instead, they're interpreted history. They show us what God was doing and how he was at work in the history of his people. The third section is called Poetry. This includes the books of Job through Song of Solomon. Many sections of these books contain poetry, like the Psalms, or some of these books have collections of aphorisms like the book of Proverbs. The fourth section is called the Major Prophets. The Major Prophets include the books of Isaiah to Daniel. They're called the Major Prophets because they're longer. Although they are books of prophecy, they don't just talk about the future. Isaiah and the other prophets were writing and preaching for the people that lived at the same time as they did, but they also looked toward the future to see what God would do in the years and generations to come. The fifth and final section is called the Minor Prophets. These are the books Hosea through Malachi. Now, they're not called minor because they're less important, but simply because they're shorter. Much like the Major Prophets, they deal with prophecy, not just in the future, but they talk about what God was doing at that time while the prophets were living. But just like the Major Prophets, the Minor Prophets look to the future to see what God was going to do, specifically what he was going to do through his Messiah. As you study the Old Testament, all this information is helpful. I'd especially encourage you to go back and look at the graph that depicts the structure of the Old Testament books and compare it to your table of contents. If you understand how the Old Testament is put together, it'll help you in reading, understanding, and applying the Old Testament to your life.